The MCAT Cars Podcast, session number 52. The cars section of the MCAT gives thousands of pre-meds nightmares every night. Whether you're an ESL student, lack confidence while reading, or a slow reader like me, Jack Westin and the medical school headquarters are here to help you score higher in every section so you can be confident you're ready to get the MCAT score of your dreams. Welcome to the MCAT Cars Podcast. Thank you for joining myself and Jack Westin from jackwestin.com today. If you're new to the MCAT Cars Podcast, thank you for finding us and thank you for taking some time to listen. I highly encourage you to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen to podcasts. I highly recommend listening and subscribing so that you get this podcast for free every week. Now, in this podcast, we're going to do a deep dive into an article that Jack Westin and his team have provided. We're going to break down each of the sentences. We're going to break down the paragraphs, and we're going to get to the core of what the author is trying to tell us. That is at the heart of what the MCAT is about, trying to understand what the test writers are trying to tell us. And if you can do that, then you can score well on the MCAT. After listening to this episode, stay tuned for how you can learn more about Jack Westin and the Jack Westin MCAT course to help you on your cars section. Jack Westin back for some more MCAT Cars podcasts. Hope you're doing well today. What's going on?
I'm doing great. How's it going, Ryan?
It's going. I'm excited. I'm excited to read and to learn and to enjoy the passage, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. I've been thinking about this one for a couple weeks, so it'll be good.
All right. What should we be prepared for with this passage?
You know, I had a bunch of students this past month ask me, "Hey, I love the podcast. Can you show us how you would do a psych social or science passage? You know, if you want to read a science passage or a psych social passage." So I think this is pretty close. This is like a hybrid of the two. So okay. I like to call this the dream because I think any student who reads these kinds of passages will love them because it's science-oriented, medicine-related.
Yeah.
But it's very similar to what you're going to see on cars or what you might see on psych social or the sciences. So, it's right in there.
Okay. All right. So follow along in the show notes or in your podcast app with paragraph 1. Modern medicine can be seen as a quest to understand pathogenesis, the biological cause of an illness. All right. So the author, right off the bat, right, kind of defining modern medicine, this quest to understand pathogenesis.
Okay. Yeah. And they're defining it for you. So you are responsible for this.
Yeah.
Right. You have to know what this means. Go ahead.
Once pathogenesis, the word comes from the Greek pathos, suffering, and genesis, origin, has been established by scientific experiment. Accurate diagnoses can be made and targeted therapies developed. All right, so the author painting a picture of why we need to understand this pathogenesis, right? Once we have it, we can make a diagnosis and we can treat.
Pretty clear, right?
Yeah.
But this is tough for the non-science or non-medicine student. You know, I would say this, students love that, pre-meds love this. They're like, oh yeah, I love this. This is, this makes sense to me. I get it. But this is not that easy sometimes to understand. Go ahead.
In the early years of the AIDS epidemic, there were all kinds of theories about what was causing it. Toxicity from drug use during sex, allergic reactions to semen, and so on. All right, so the author kind of giving an example of AIDS, right? HIV and AIDS, of we didn't have the pathogenesis, so we were just guessing as to what was going on.
Right. I mean, like these sound really ridiculous now, right? Because we know it, but at some point we had no idea, right? How you acquired AIDS. Okay, go ahead.
Only after the discovery of the human immunodeficiency virus helped lay such conjectures to rest did it become possible to use specific blood tests for diagnosis and eventually to provide antiviral drugs to improve immune defenses. All right, so just laying out the first sentence of modern medicine saying, hey, once we have the pathogenesis, we can diagnose and we can treat.
Right. So the key is what? Like, what do you have to know from this paragraph? I mean, you just basically broke it down.
Yeah.
Right. Understand the cause of the disease.
Yep.
Right. In order to treat it.
Yep.
Okay.
And
Sounds
that's
good.
and that's what the author is saying is modern medicine.
Exactly. So AIDS, HIV was an example of that. Great. Go ahead.
All right, paragraph 2. Sometimes a disease's pathogenesis is surprising. So a little fun twist here. So I'm excited to see what the author considers surprising. So I think that's part of like enjoying reading it. You're like, oh, like what's going to happen?
Yeah, right.
As a medical student, I was taught that peptic ulcers were often caused by stress. Treatments included bed rest and a soothing diet rich in milk. Oh, I know what this twist is. All right, so the author is obviously a physician, or at least was a medical student at some point. Doesn't necessarily mean they graduated. And the author is talking about peptic ulcers and what they used to do for treatment. Anyone who had suggested that ulcers were the result of bacterial infection would have been thought crazy. All right, so apparently there were people suggesting a different pathogenesis, but they were considered crazy.
Right. Now, a lot of students reading this would have no idea why it would be crazy to suggest that it's a bacterial infection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you don't understand the stomach or, GI tract, etc., whatever it is, but it doesn't matter. Even if you're a non-science student, even if you didn't take biology, you know nothing about this stuff, right? As a pre-med, you're not expected to really. You have to understand that some things were not considered, right? They weren't just not considered. That's the key here. Go ahead.
Yep. The prevailing view was that no bacterium could thrive in the acidic environment of the stomach. All right, so that's why people were considered crazy, right? It can't happen. But in 1982, 2 Australian researchers who later won a Nobel Prize for their work proposed that a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori was crucial to the onset of many peptic ulcers. All right, so we have Australians in 1982 basically proposing a specific bacteria that is the cause of this.
Yeah, sounds good.
Although the hypothesis was met with widespread scorn, experimental evidence gradually became conclusive. All right, so again, widespread scorn. I'm not sure the exact definition of scorn, but it probably goes back to people thinking you're crazy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
And then evidence becoming conclusive, meaning they're proving that this bacteria is causing it.
Exactly.
Now ulcers are routinely healed with antibiotics. All right. So this paragraph is all about at least one specific, right? So the first paragraph, we get a very brief mention of HIV and kind of the weird thoughts about that was going on with that. And then this one's a more in-depth story of ulcers and how nobody thought it could be bacteria, but then a couple people proved it.
Yeah, so it's just surprising, where these diseases actually come from.
Yeah.
What causes these diseases. So same thing, it's still going back to, what we're talking about from the first paragraph, right? The biological cause of an illness is still the key here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you remember how the researchers proved it? Do you know that story?
I don't know.
Yeah. So I think one of the researchers, at least that's the story I heard. One of the research actually just ingested a whole vial of this bacteria.
Oh my God.
And gave himself ulcers. He's like, surprise, it works.
That's crazy.
So, yeah, got a Nobel Prize from it. So I think you get $1 million for that or something like that. All right, paragraph 3. But what can medicine do when pathogenesis remains elusive? Ooh, so this is a good question. This is something I talk about a ton with people. That's a question that has bedeviled the field of psychiatry for nearly a century and a half. Okay, another little twist here. So now we're going specifically into psychiatry. And I think a lot of students will go, oh yeah, like it's hard to prove a lot of things in psychiatry, right?
Right. What does bedeviled mean?
I have no idea.
What does it kind of sound like?
That is a question that has, if I try to throw a synonym in there,
Try to cut it down. Try to look in the middle of the question or the word.
Devil. Yeah.
Right. So
It's
maybe
been
it's something
bad to psychiatry, the field of psychiatry.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. In Mind Fixers, written by Norton and Harrington, a history of science professor at Harvard follows, quote, psychiatry's troubled search for the biology of mental illness, deftly tracing a progression of paradigms adopted by neurologists, psychiatrists, and psychologists, as well as patients and their advocates. Whew. All right. So long sentence here. Basically just highlighting a book written by Norton, a history of science professor at Harvard, and what the book was about.
What does deftly mean?
So my assumption, it talks about deftly tracing a progression. So like in depth or vigorously, maybe.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of I would say a lot of ESL students will see that word and just focus on it. Oh, I don't know that word, and then they just start doubting themselves. The context matters. Don't worry about one word.
Yeah.
Keep reading. Try to get the context. Try to get the point of the sentence. Right.
Yeah.
Don't lose focus on that. All right. Great.
Is a potential strategy very quickly, I think, potentially for an ESL student specifically is what if I read that same part of the sentence without deftly? Does potential meaning change much? Right. No. If I just said in Mind Fixers, blah, 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 tracing a progression of paradigms versus deftly tracing, I'm like, I don't think it changes much. Right. You just have to guess. But is that a good strategy or no?
It's a great strategy.
Okay.
Yeah. Just ignore it. You know, focus on the things you do know, not the things you don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Paragraph 4. Her narrative begins in the late 19th century when researchers explored the brain's anatomy in an attempt to identify the origins of mental disorders. All right, so we're talking about the author in Harrington. I said Norton. I'm assuming Norton maybe is the publisher. So in Harrington's the author here, this professor at Harvard, and it's just talking about what she did, the narrative inside the book. Where it starts. The studies ultimately proved fruitless, and their failure produced a split in the field. So the research looking at anatomy, trying to find out the origins of mental disorders, that failed, and apparently there was a split. Hopefully they defined the split.
Know. Right. Okay.
Yeah. Some psychiatrists sought non-biological causes, including psychoanalytic ones, for mental disorders. All right, so there's part of it. We have some psychiatrists doing one thing there. Others double down on the biological approach, and as she writes, increasingly pursued a hodgepodge of theories and projects, many of which, in hindsight, look both ill-considered and incautious. Oh man, I'm like, as a student, I'm like, this was a hard one, right? Hodgepodge, incautious, ill-considered. So I think the author is just saying some of them looked at non-biological causes, some looked at a biological approach, and I think the language is saying it wasn't very good, the ones that were looking at this biological approach.
Correct. So it's still debatable, right? We don't really know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the last sentence here, the split is still evident today. So we still don't know, right? Some people think one and some people think the other.
Right.
All right.
So interesting to point out that, we figured out where diseases come from for some good, important diseases.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have these mental disorders, right? That we can't necessarily pinpoint exactly. So we still have this issue.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
All right. Paragraph 5. The history that Harrington relays is a series of pendulum swings. right, so again, just talking more about Harrington and the book and what she lays out. So pendulum swings. What does that mean? So I think of pendulum swings, right? We kind of go too far in one direction as far as what's the reason, and then that doesn't work out. So we go too far in the other direction, and that doesn't work out, and so we just keep going back and forth and back and forth.
That's exactly it. So if you can visualize what a pendulum does when it's swinging, right, and kind of relate this to what we're currently discussing, you have a better idea of the author's position, of the author's point of view, right? The author is basically trying to convey that we just don't know, right? And the author's trying to do this through some kind of visual means or some kind of analogy, which is that pendulum swinging, right? Going back and forth. The swing is a sense that we're not sure.
Yeah. Okay. For much of the book, touted breakthroughs disappoint. Discredited dogmas give rise to counter-dogmas. Treatments are influenced by the financial interests of the pharmaceutical industry, shocker, and real harm is done to patients and their loved ones. All right, so just more description of the book here that just the tumultuous, it's not a very good word to use on this podcast, the kind of just the history of everything that mental disorders and trying to find cause, everything it's been through.
Okay, so this was a loaded sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Is this good or bad stuff that's happening because we don't know?
Bad.
So isn't this trying to reinforce the fact that pathogenesis is important?
Yeah.
Right? Like we need that. It's essentially trying to convey that it's a necessary thing for us to really pinpoint the disease, and treat it that way. Mm. It's also loaded in the sense that it says treatments are influenced by financial interest of the pharmaceutical industry. What is that trying to assume or imply?
Well, I mean, if I wanted to take a bad look, it's the pharmaceutical industry creating treatments for diseases that we don't know what's causing them. So how can you create a treatment?
Right. So
they're just trying to make money.
Don't be surprised if the MCAT asks questions about this.
Yep.
Right. Like they'll point this out and they'll go, well, what does this mean? And then you have to kind of think it through. Okay, financial and interests and the fact that we don't know, that all ties in when you pick the answer. Okay.
One thing that becomes apparent is that when pathogenesis is absent, historical events and cultural shifts have an outsized influence on prevailing views on causes and treatments. Oh, that's a very interesting statement as a physician. Okay, so the author is saying that when we don't know what's going on, so much outside of medicine influences how we view what's going on medically and causes and treatments.
Yep.
Oh, very interesting. I've never really thought about it that way, but that's a powerful statement.
I mean, it's kind of similar to any event that we can't explain, right? If we can't explain it, we'll use our culture. If we don't have science to back something, we depend on other means, right? So it kind of makes sense. It is a big point, and you should definitely know it when you're going through the questions, right? It's something that it's an opinion, right? And you have to stick to it.
Yeah, so I can easily see a question tying back to the first paragraph, talking about HIV and AIDS, potentially like before HIV, that would be kind of a loaded question. Like before HIV was discovered, right? The fear of or the homophobia or something around, right? Homophobia was why we thought these gay men were becoming ill or something like that. Talking about the culture, right?
Right. Yeah. So maybe some kind of like some kind of negative influence from, I don't know, let's say religion or God or something, right? Something cultural related instead of actually.
Yeah. It's not HIV. They're being punished because of that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Right. It seems obvious once you read it, but I never really thought about it in that way. Okay. By charting our fluctuating beliefs about our own minds, Harrington effectively tells a story about the 20th century itself. Okay, so this is very interesting. A very interesting passage that you're like, oh, I'm going to talk about HIV and antivirals and H. pylori. And then we go into this book that talks about 20th century itself. So it's very, very interesting little twist here.
Right. There is more to this article that we're not going to read. But for what we've read so far, what do you think the author is trying to convey?
The author, I think, obviously there's a huge focus on psychiatry, on mental illness, and basically the very beginning sets up, we need to understand pathogenesis to create a diagnosis and treatment, and mental disorders, right? The field of psychiatry just can't do that at this point.
That's it. So they define something. They want you to understand it. They gave examples of it. They gave an example of when it's not possible and how that's bad. So that's the structure of this passage. Now, at the very end, they're starting to go into this idea of culture and how maybe this shows us clues to how our culture works, etc. But that's not that important. You need to know the bigger picture. Pathogenesis is not possible necessarily for mental health diagnoses, and that is a problem.
All right, so there you have it. Another great episode about mental illness today. Very interesting discussion. If you are looking for more help with your MCAT cars, check out Jack Westin's Cars course, which you can find at medicalschoolhq.net/Jack Westin, or just text the word MCAT cars, all one word, to 44222, and that'll activate a $100 off coupon for you. When you use that coupon, I get a small commission as well. So you save, I get a little beer money, everyone wins. And hopefully you get a better MCAT score, a car score as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode today, and I hope, again, you subscribe so that you can get this podcast every week for free right in your app. Next week, we have a great discussion about esports. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT Cars Podcast.
This is MedEd Media.